long before Rome became an empire of marble, legions, and emperors. It existed only as a quiet stretch of land beside the Tiber River. The hills were covered in wild grass, and the air carried nothing but the sounds of wind, water, and distant animals. There were no temples, no roads, no walls, only the stillness of a world not yet shaped by history. But Rome, like many great civilizations, begins not with certainty, but with a story. According to legend, the roots of Rome trace back to a woman named Rhea Silvia. She was a Vestal virgin, sworn to a life of chastity, serving the sacred flame of the gods. Yet fate does not always bend to human vows. It is said that Mars, the god of war, came to her in silence, unseen, undeniable, and from that union she gave birth to twin sons, Romulus and Remus. Their birth was not celebrated. It was feared. Rhea Silvia's uncle, King Amulius, had taken the throne by force and saw the twins as a threat to his power. Fearing they might one day challenge him, he ordered that the infants be taken away and cast into the Tiber River, left to die before they could even speak their names. The command was carried out. The twins were placed into a small basket and set upon the water, but the river, swollen from seasonal rains, moved slowly that day. Instead of carrying them away into death, it gently guided the basket to the muddy banks beneath a fig tree at the foot of the Palatine Hill. There, something unexpected happened. A she-wolf found them. In later retellings, she would be described as fierce, almost mythical, but in the oldest versions of the story, she is simply a creature of instinct, a mother without offspring. Drawn by their cries, she approached, lowered her head, and took the children into her care. In a quiet cave, known as the Lupercal, she nursed them and kept them alive. Not long after, a shepherd named Faustulus discovered the boys. Realizing they were no ordinary children, he brought them home and raised them alongside his own family. The twins grew among fields and flocks, strong, restless, and fearless. Even as children, they were different. They led other boys, settled disputes, and showed a natural command over those around them. As they matured, the truth of their birth slowly came to light. Learning of their royal lineage and the injustice done to them, they returned to Alba Longa, overthrew King Amulius, and restored their grandfather to the throne. They could have stayed there. They could have lived in comfort, as nobles of an existing city. But something pulled them back to the wild land beside the Tiber, to the place where they had been saved, where their lives had begun. There, they decided to build something new, a city. Yet even in its earliest moment, Rome was shaped by conflict. The brothers could not agree on where the city should rise or who should rule it. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill, while Remus preferred the Aventine. To settle the dispute, they turned to the gods, watching the skies for omens. Remus claimed to see birds first. Romulus claimed to see more. What began as a disagreement soon turned into something darker. The argument escalated, and in the end, it was settled not by signs or reason, but by violence. Remus was killed, whether by Romulus himself or by one of his followers. The stories differ, but the outcome remains the same. One brother died, one brother remained. Romulus, now alone, drew a boundary around the chosen hill. He marked the sacred limits of his city and declared that anyone who crossed those lines without permission would be put to death. It was a warning, a rule, and perhaps a reflection of how Rome itself would grow, through strength, through conflict, and through an unyielding will to survive. According to tradition, the founding of Rome took place on April 21st, in the year 753 BCE. Romulus named the city after himself. And so, Rome was born. At first, it was nothing more than a cluster of huts, surrounded by rough defenses and inhabited by men drawn from nearby lands. But even in those early days, the foundation had already been set. a city born from myth, forged in violence, guided by ambition, and destined, as its people would come to believe, for greatness. After the death of Romulus, the city he founded did not vanish into myth. It endured. What had begun as a fragile settlement of huts and ambition slowly grew into something more complex, a living community shaped not only by strength, but by structure. The early Romans, still close to their origins in legend, now faced a new question. Who would lead them next? Rome would not yet be a republic. For generations to come, it would be ruled by kings. According to Roman tradition, there were 7 in total, each one leaving a mark upon the city, each one shaping Rome in ways that would echo far beyond their time. The first king had been Romulus, a figure of war and foundation. But his successor would be very different. Numa Pompilius, the second king, was not a warrior, but a man of peace. He was said to be wise, thoughtful, and deeply connected to the divine. Where Romulus had built walls and commanded armies, Numa turned his attention inward. He gave Rome something it did not yet possess: order, rhythm, and spiritual identity. Under Numa, temples were constructed, religious rituals were formalized, and priesthoods were established. He organized the calendar, dividing time into sacred and civic cycles, teaching the people when to work, when to rest, and when to honor the gods. Rome was no longer just a place of survival, it was becoming a society. The people learned that strength did not come only from the sword, but also from tradition, from shared beliefs that bound them together in something greater than themselves. After Numa came Tullus Hostilius, the third king. Where Numa had valued peace, Tullus embraced war. He expanded Rome's power through conquest, destroying rival cities such as Alba Longa and bringing their people into Rome. This was a crucial transformation. Rome was no longer just growing, it was absorbing. Different peoples, different traditions, now merged within its walls. This blending would become one of Rome's greatest strengths. The fourth king, Ancus Marcius, combined the qualities of both his predecessors. He was both builder and warrior. Under his rule, Rome expanded its territory further and strengthened its infrastructure. Bridges were constructed across the Tiber River, allowing trade and movement to flourish. The port of Ostia was founded near the coast, connecting Rome to the wider Mediterranean world. Rome was no longer isolated, it was becoming connected. Then came a shift. The next 3 kings were said to be of Etruscan origin, a neighboring civilization, more advanced in engineering, art, and political organization. Their influence would change Rome dramatically. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the 5th king, introduced grand construction projects that transformed the physical appearance of the city. The Circus Maximus, a massive arena for public games, was begun under his rule. He also expanded the Senate, bringing new families into the political structure. Rome was becoming not only stronger, but more sophisticated. Servius Tullius, the 6th king, is remembered as one of the most important reformers in early Roman history. His origins were humble. Some said he was born to a slave woman, yet he rose to power through ability rather than lineage. Under Servius, Rome underwent a major transformation in how its people were organized. He introduced a census, dividing citizens into classes based on wealth rather than birth. This system influenced military service, taxation, and political participation. It was a subtle but powerful change. For the first time, society was being structured not only by heritage, but by contribution. Servius also expanded the city itself, building defensive walls around Rome that would protect it for generations. These walls symbolized something deeper than security. They marked Rome as a true city. But as with many rulers before and after, his reign ended in violence. He was overthrown and murdered by his own son-in-law. The man who took his place would become the final king of Rome, Lucius Tarquinius, Superbus Tarquin, the Proud. His rule would bring the age of kings to its end. Unlike those before him, Tarquin did not seek balance or reform. He ruled through fear, ignoring the Senate and silencing opposition. His projects were grand, including the construction of the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, but they were built on forced labor and harsh control. Rome grew under him, but it did not trust him. Power, when held too tightly, often creates its own downfall. The breaking point came not from politics, but from a single act of cruelty. According to tradition, Tarquin's son committed a violent crime against a noblewoman named Lucretia. Unable to bear the dishonor, she took her own life, but not before calling for justice. Her death ignited outrage across Rome. It became a symbol of tyranny, of a ruling family that had lost all sense of restraint. The people rose. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, a revolt began that would change Rome forever. Tarquin was expelled, his family cast out, and the monarchy itself was abolished. The age of kings had ended. For over 2 centuries, Rome had been shaped by its rulers, by warriors and priests, builders and reformers, tyrants and visionaries. They had laid the foundations of religion, law, infrastructure, and identity. They had turned a settlement into a city. But they had also taught Rome something else. That power, when left unchecked, becomes dangerous. And so, the Romans made a decision that would define the next chapter of their history. They would never be ruled by a king again, or so they believed. The fall of the last king did not bring immediate peace to Rome. It brought uncertainty. For generations, the Romans had lived under the rule of kings. Even when those kings were flawed, the structure itself had been simple: one ruler, one authority, one voice at the top. Now, that voice was gone, and in its place stood a question that had no clear answer. Who would rule Rome? The people had overthrown Tarquin the Proud, not just because of his cruelty, but because they had grown to fear what unchecked power could become. They had seen what happened when a single man held authority without limits, when law bent to will, and justice depended on favor. They did not want another king. They would never call anyone king again. But Rome still needed to be governed. So instead of replacing one ruler with another, the Romans attempted something new, something fragile, something untested. They created a republic. The word itself, res publica, meant the public thing. It was the idea that the state did not belong to a single ruler, but to the people as a whole. In theory, power would no longer be held permanently. It would be shared, divided, limited. At the center of this new system were 2 officials known as consuls. Each year, 2 consuls would be elected to lead the state. They held the highest authority in Rome, commanding armies, overseeing government, and enforcing laws. But their power came with a crucial condition. It was temporary. After 1 year, their term ended, and each consul could veto the actions of the other. It was a system built on balance, a deliberate attempt to prevent any one man from becoming too powerful. But the consuls did not rule alone. The Senate remained. It was a council of elders, made up of Rome's most experienced and influential men, many from noble families who had long held positions of authority. The Senate did not pass laws in the modern sense, but it advised, guided, and shaped decisions. Its influence was immense. Even without formal control, it often directed the course of the Republic. Below them were the assemblies gatherings of Roman citizens who voted on laws, elected officials, and made decisions that, in theory, represented the will of the people. It was a complex structure. More voices, more layers, more tension. On parchment, it appeared orderly. In reality, it was anything but. Because while Rome had removed its kings, it had not removed inequality. Society was still divided. At the top were the patricians, the old aristocratic families who traced their lineage back to the earliest days of Rome. They dominated the Senate, held most political power, and believed it was their natural right to lead. Below them were the plebeians, The vast majority of the population, farmers, artisans, laborers, soldiers, they formed the backbone of Rome, yet had little say in how it was governed. They fought in wars, they paid taxes, but they were often excluded from power. The Republic, for all its ideals, was not yet a system of equality. It was a system in transition, and transitions are rarely smooth. In its earliest years, the Republic faced constant pressure, not only from outside enemies, but from within its own walls. The plebeians began to realize something important. Without them, Rome could not function. So they did something radical. They walked away. In what became known as the First Secession of the Plebs, large numbers of citizens left the city and refused to return. They withdrew their labor, their military service, their participation in the state. Rome, suddenly, was missing its foundation. The patricians were forced to respond. Compromise followed. From this crisis emerged a new office, the tribune of the plebs. These officials were chosen by the plebeians themselves and were granted special powers to protect the people. They could veto decisions made by consuls or the Senate, and their persons were considered sacred. Harming a tribune was a grave offense. It was a breakthrough, a shift in the balance of power. But it was only the beginning. The struggle between patricians and plebeians would continue for generations. The plebeians demanded more than representation. They demanded transparency. At the time, laws were not written down. They were known only to a select few, interpreted by the elite, and often used to maintain control. This had to change. Eventually, the Romans agreed to create a written code of laws, the 12 Tables. These laws were engraved on bronze tablets and displayed publicly in the Roman Forum. For the first time, every citizen could see the rules that governed them. Justice, while still imperfect, became visible, knowable, shared. It was a defining moment in Roman history. The Republic was learning, adapting, shaping itself through conflict. Yet even as these internal struggles unfolded, Rome faced constant threats from beyond its borders. Rival cities, tribes, and neighboring powers tested its strength again and again. The Republic had to defend itself, and in doing so, it grew stronger. The system, though flawed, proved resilient. It allowed Rome to survive crisis after crisis, not because it was perfect, but because it could change. Power shifted, roles evolved, new offices were created, old traditions were challenged. Rome was becoming something more than a city. It was becoming an idea that power should not rest in one pair of hands, that authority should be temporary, that even the strongest leaders should be held in check. It was not always upheld, it was often bent, sometimes broken, but the belief remained. For centuries, Romans would look back at this moment, the birth of the Republic, as the turning point that defined them, not as subjects, but as citizens. And yet, beneath that identity, something else continued to grow. Ambition. The same force that had shaped Rome from its earliest myths, the same force that had built its walls, expanded its borders, and driven its people forward. The Republic had replaced the king, but it had not removed the desire for power. And in time, that desire would test the system in ways no one could yet imagine. The Roman Republic had been born from a rejection of kings, but removing a king did not create equality. Beneath the surface of Rome's new political system, a deeper conflict was already growing quiet at first, but persistent. It was not a war of armies or foreign enemies. It was a struggle within the city itself, a struggle between two groups who lived side by side, yet did not share the same power. The patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the old families of Rome. They traced their ancestry back to the earliest days of the city, claiming descent from its founders and the men who had advised its kings. They held land, wealth, and influence. Most importantly, they controlled the Senate and the highest offices of government. To them, leadership was not something to be earned, it was something inherited. The plebeians, on the other hand, were everyone else. Farmers who worked the land, artisans who built the city, merchants who kept trade alive, soldiers who fought Rome's wars. They were the majority, the body of Rome itself. Yet, they stood outside the structures that governed them. They could not hold high office. They could not marry into patrician families. They often found themselves judged by laws they did not fully know, because those laws were not written. They were spoken, remembered, controlled, and in that control, power was preserved. At first, the imbalance was tolerated. Rome was still young, still fragile, still surrounded by enemies. Unity mattered more than fairness. Survival came before reform. But over time, the strain grew. The plebeians carried the weight of the Republic in its fields, in its armies, in its labor, yet they remained excluded from its rewards. When they returned from war, many found themselves in debt. Some lost their land. Others fell into a form of bondage to wealthier creditors. They were expected to defend Rome. But Rome did not yet defend them. The tension could not remain hidden forever. In 494 BCE, it reached a breaking point. The plebeians did something unprecedented. They left. In what would later be called the first secession of the plebes, large numbers of citizens withdrew from the city and gathered on a hill outside its walls. They refused to work. They refused to fight. They refused to return unless their voices were recognized. It was not a violent rebellion. It was something quieter and more powerful. Rome, suddenly, was incomplete. Without its workers, its soldiers, its people, the Republic could not function. The patricians, faced with the reality of a city that could not sustain itself, were forced to negotiate. From this crisis emerged one of the most important offices in Roman history, the tribune of the plebes. These tribunes were elected by the plebeians themselves and given a unique authority. They could intervene on behalf of the people. They could veto decisions made by consuls or the Senate. And most importantly, they were protected by law, their bodies declared sacrosanct, untouchable. To harm a tribune was to challenge the very structure of the Republic. For the first time, the plebeians had a shield, a voice, a presence within the system. But the struggle was far from over, because representation alone did not solve the deeper problem. The laws themselves remained unclear, unwritten, open to interpretation by those who held power. And so, the plebeians demanded something more. They demanded that the laws be written down, that justice be visible, that no citizen, regardless of status, could be judged by rules hidden behind tradition and memory. It was a radical idea, one that challenged the authority of the patrician class. But once again, pressure forced change. Around 451 BCE, a group of officials known as the decemviri were appointed to create a formal code of law. They studied existing customs, examined practices from other societies, and began to record the rules that governed Roman life. The result was the 12 Tables. These laws were engraved onto bronze tablets and displayed publicly in the Roman Forum, where any citizen could read them, learn them, and understand them. It was a turning point. Justice, for the first time, there was no longer hidden. It had been brought into the open. The 12 Tables did not create equality. They still reflected the divisions of Roman society, but they created something just as important: clarity, consistency, a shared framework. They established rules for property, family, debt, and legal procedure. They defined rights and responsibilities. They limited, at least in part, the ability of elites to manipulate the system for their own advantage. For the plebeians, it was a victory, but like all victories in Rome, it was incomplete. The conflict between the orders continued. Over generations, the plebeians pressed for more access to offices, to privileges, to recognition as full participants in the Republic. Slowly, step by step, they gained ground. They won the right to marry patricians. They gained access to political positions. Eventually, even the highest offices of the state would open to them. But each advance came through pressure, through negotiation, through moments of crisis that forced the system to adapt. Rome was learning that stability did not come from silence. It came from tension managed over time, from a balance that was never fixed, but always shifting. The Republic was not a perfect system. It was not fair in the way later generations might define fairness. But it was flexible, and that flexibility allowed it to survive, to grow, to transform. The struggle between patricians and plebeians did more than reshape Roman politics. It reshaped Roman identity. It taught the people that power could be challenged, that tradition could be changed, that even the most established structures were not beyond question. These lessons would echo far beyond this period. They would influence every future crisis, every reform, every conflict that Rome would face. Because beneath its laws, beneath its armies, beneath its growing power, Rome was still what it had always been. A city shaped by struggle, and in that struggle, it found its strength. Rome did not become powerful in a single moment. It did not awaken one day as a master of lands and peoples. Its rise was slower than that, harder, bloodier, and far more uncertain. Long after the Republic had been established, Rome was still just one city among many on the Italian peninsula. It stood surrounded by rivals, proud tribes, ancient cities, and powerful cultures that had no intention of yielding to a growing neighbor. The land itself was not empty, it was contested. To the north lived the Etruscans, a sophisticated civilization with deep traditions, skilled artisans, and strong urban centers. To the south, Greek colonies thrived along the coast, wealthy and culturally refined, tied to the wider Hellenic world. In the central mountains, fierce tribal peoples like the Samnites held rugged terrain that was difficult to conquer and even harder to control. Rome was not destined to rule them. It had to fight for every mile. In its early years, the Republic's expansion was not part of a grand strategy. It was a series of conflicts, some defensive, others opportunistic, shaped by necessity as much as ambition. Neighboring communities clashed over land, resources, and influence. Alliances formed and dissolved. Treaties were made, then broken. War became a constant rhythm. One of the earliest major struggles came with the Latin League, a coalition of cities that had once stood alongside Rome as equals. But as Rome grew stronger, equality became uneasy. Tensions rose, and eventually, the Latin cities rebelled. Rome responded with force. The war was decisive. When it ended, Rome did not simply destroy its rivals. Instead, it did something more subtle and far more effective. It reorganized the region. Rather than allowing cities to unite against it again, Rome bound each one individually to itself through separate agreements. Some were granted partial citizenship. Others retained local autonomy, but were required to provide soldiers and loyalty. It was not unity, it was control through connection. This system would become one of Rome's greatest strengths. From there, Rome turned its attention to the Samnites. The Samnite Wars would last for generations, fought across difficult terrain, narrow valleys, steep hills, and forested passes. These conflicts tested Rome in ways it had never experienced before. The Samnites were not easily defeated. They fought with flexibility, using ambushes and mobility to counter Rome's structured legions. At times, Rome suffered deeply. One of its most humiliating defeats came at the Caudine Forks, where a Roman army was trapped and forced to surrender. The soldiers were made to pass beneath a symbolic yoke, a ritual of submission that left a lasting scar on Roman pride. But Rome did not collapse. It adapted, learning from its enemies. Rome reformed its military organization. It became more flexible, more responsive to terrain, more disciplined in coordination. Roads were built to move troops quickly. Alliances were strengthened. Defeats were studied, not forgotten, and slowly, relentlessly, Rome pushed forward. The Samnites were worn down. Their resistance faded. Their lands came under Roman control. But Rome's expansion did not stop there. To the south lay the Greek cities of Magna Graecia, wealthy, cultured, and deeply connected to the traditions of the Greek world. These cities viewed Rome with suspicion, even disdain. To them, Rome was still a rising power from the interior, ambitious but unrefined. When tensions escalated, one of these cities, Tarentum, sought help from across the sea. That help came in the form of a king, Pyrrhus of Epirus. A skilled commander and a relative of Alexander the Great's lineage, Pyrrhus arrived in Italy with a seasoned army, including war elephants, creatures unfamiliar and terrifying to Roman forces. At first, he was victorious. He defeated Roman armies in battle, demonstrating tactical brilliance and experience. But each victory came at a cost so heavy that it became unsustainable. After one such battle, he is said to have remarked that another victory like it would destroy him. It was a different kind of defeat, not immediate, but inevitable. Rome, once again, endured. It replaced its losses, reinforced its armies, and continued the fight. Pyrrhus, unable to sustain his campaign, eventually withdrew. The Greek cities were left alone. One by one, they fell under Roman influence. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, the balance of power in Italy had shifted completely. The Etruscans had been absorbed, the Samnites subdued, the Latin cities reorganized, the Greek colonies brought into Rome's sphere. There was no longer any rival capable of challenging Rome's authority across the peninsula. Italy was Roman, but Rome did not govern it as a single unified state. Instead, it maintained its complex network of relationships, colonies, allied cities, and varying levels of citizenship. Some communities were fully integrated. Others remained distinct, but tied to Rome through obligation and mutual interest. This system was not equal, but it was effective. It ensured loyalty without requiring uniformity. It created a structure where many peoples with different languages and traditions could exist under Roman influence without immediate resistance. And most importantly, it gave Rome something invaluable: manpower. From across Italy, soldiers could be drawn into Rome's armies. These were not mercenaries, but allies, bound by treaties, incentives, and shared outcomes. With each victory, Rome grew stronger, not just in territory, but in capacity. Its legions became more experienced, its commanders more capable, its infrastructure more developed. Roads stretched across the land, linking cities and regions in a network that allowed Rome to move faster than any of its rivals. Communication improved, trade expanded. Control deepened. The conquest of Italy was not just about land. It was about building a system that could support expansion far beyond its original borders. And that moment was approaching, because to the south, across the narrow waters of the Mediterranean, another power had been watching. A power built not on land, but on the sea. A power that controlled trade routes, fleets, and distant territories. Its name was Carthage. Rome had secured Italy, but the next challenge would not be a neighboring tribe or a rival city. It would be something larger, something equal. The wars of Italy had taught Rome how to fight. The wars to come would teach it how to rule an empire. By the time Rome had secured control over the Italian peninsula, it was no longer just a rising power. It had become a force. But beyond its borders, across the waters of the Mediterranean, another power had already risen, older, wealthier, and far more experienced in the affairs of empire. Its name was Carthage. Carthage stood on the coast of North Africa, a city of harbours and trade, its wealth drawn not from land armies, but from the sea. Its ships moved across the Mediterranean like veins of commerce, connecting distant lands through trade, influence, and quiet ambition. For a time, Rome and Carthage existed in uneasy balance. They expanded in different directions. They avoided direct conflict. But between them lay a place that neither could ignore: Sicily. The island was rich, fertile, and strategically positioned a gateway between worlds. Whoever controlled Sicily would control the movement of trade, armies, and influence across the central Mediterranean. And so, tension became inevitable. The spark came from a small conflict, a dispute involving a group of mercenaries in the Sicilian city of Messana. But what began as a local struggle quickly drew in larger forces. Carthage moved first, Rome followed, and in doing so, it stepped beyond Italy for the first time. The First Punic War had begun. It was a war unlike any Rome had fought before. Carthage dominated the sea. Rome did not. At the beginning of the conflict, Rome had little naval experience. Its strength lay in land warfare, in disciplined legions and structured formations. But the war demanded something different, so Rome did what it would do again and again throughout its history. It learned. It adapted. Roman engineers studied, captured Carthaginian ships, and built their own fleets, training crews from scratch. But they did not try to become Carthage. Instead, they transformed naval warfare into something familiar. They introduced the corvus, a boarding bridge that allowed Roman soldiers to cross onto enemy ships and fight as if they were on land. Sea battles became extensions of Roman strength. The war dragged on for more than 2 decades. Fleets were lost to storms. Armies clashed across Sicily. Cities changed hands again and again. Victory was uncertain, but Rome endured. In 241 BCE, after years of struggle, Rome achieved a decisive naval victory. Carthage, exhausted, sued for peace. The terms were harsh. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. For the first time, Rome held territory beyond Italy. It was a turning point, but the peace that followed was fragile. Carthage turned its attention westward, rebuilding its power in Spain. There, its generals gathered resources, wealth, and soldiers preparing, whether intentionally or not, for what would come next. Among them was a man whose name would echo through history: Hannibal. From a young age, Hannibal had been shaped by war. It is said that as a child, he swore an oath to never be a friend of Rome. He would keep that oath. In 218 BCE, the Second Punic War began. But this time, the war would not be fought on distant shores. It would come to Rome itself. Hannibal led his army from Spain, not by sea, but by land through mountains, rivers, and hostile territory. He crossed the Pyrenees. He marched through Gaul. And then, in one of the most daring maneuvers in military history, he crossed the Alps. Snow, ice, narrow paths, war elephants moving through the mountains. Many did not survive the journey, but enough did. And when Hannibal descended into Italy, he brought war to the heart of Rome's world. The Romans were unprepared. Battle after battle followed, and in each, Hannibal proved himself a master of strategy. At the Trebia River, he lured Roman forces into a trap. At Lake Trasimene, he ambushed an entire army in the mist. And then came Cannae. In 216 BCE, on a wide plain in southern Italy, Hannibal faced one of the largest Roman armies ever assembled. The Romans believed they could overwhelm him with numbers. Instead, Hannibal surrounded them. His forces bent inward, drawing the Roman army into a tightening circle. Then, from all sides, they closed in. What followed was not just a defeat, it was annihilation. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers died in a single day. It was one of the most devastating losses in Roman history. Panic spread. Allies defected. The path to Rome itself seemed open. And yet, Hannibal did not march on the city. Instead, he remained in Italy, winning battles, but unable to break Rome completely. Because Rome, once again, adapted. Rather than confronting Hannibal directly, the Roman general Fabius Maximus adopted a different approach. He avoided large battles, harassed Hannibal's forces, cut off supplies, and waited. It was a strategy of patience, of endurance. Hannibal could win battles, but he could not win the war. Meanwhile, Rome struck elsewhere. In Spain, a young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio began to rise. He captured key territories, weakened Carthaginian control, and eventually carried the war into North Africa itself. This forced Hannibal to return, and in 202 BCE, the two great commanders met. At Zama, the battle was decisive. This time, it was Rome that adapted. Scipio countered Hannibal's tactics, neutralized his war elephants, and broke his army. Hannibal was defeated. Carthage surrendered. The terms were even harsher than before. Carthage lost its territories, its fleet, its ability to wage war without Rome's permission. Rome now stood as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, but still, it was not enough. Carthage, though weakened, remained, and for some in Rome, that was unacceptable. One voice, in particular, repeated the same warning again and again. Cato the Elder. No matter the topic, he ended his speeches with the same words. Carthage must be destroyed. Years passed. Carthage rebuilt its economy, regained wealth, and remained peaceful, but prosperity itself became a threat. In 149 BCE, Rome declared war once more. The Third Punic War was not a struggle for dominance, it was an act of destruction. Carthage resisted. For 3 years, it endured siege, starvation, and relentless assault. Its people fought street by street, house by house, but in the end, the city fell. Roman forces entered, and what followed was final. Carthage was destroyed, its buildings burned, its people killed or enslaved, its existence erased. Where once stood a rival power, there was now silence. Rome had not just won, it had eliminated its greatest enemy. The Punic Wars had changed Rome forever. They had transformed it from a regional power into a Mediterranean empire. They had tested its endurance, its adaptability, its will to survive. And they had revealed something deeper about Rome itself, that it could lose battles, suffer disasters, and face near collapse, and still rise again. Stronger, more determined, more ambitious. The sea that had once divided powers was now becoming something else, a Roman sea, and beyond it lay new lands, new wars, new possibilities. Rome had conquered Italy, it had defeated Carthage, but it was only beginning to understand what it had become, an empire in all but name, and the world would soon feel the weight of that realization. After the destruction of Carthage, there were no longer any great rivals in the Western Mediterranean. Rome stood alone, but power, once gained, does not remain still. It moves, it expands, it seeks new horizons not always out of necessity, but often out of habit. And now, Rome began to look east. Across the sea lay a different world, a world shaped not by tribes and rival cities, but by ancient kingdoms and long traditions. Greece, Macedonia, and the remnants of Alexander the Great's empire still held influence over vast territories. Their cities were older than Rome, their culture more refined. Their philosophers had asked questions Rome had not yet begun to consider. At first, Rome did not arrive as a conqueror. It came as a protector, or so it claimed. Greek city-states, divided and often at odds with one another, called upon Rome for assistance against stronger neighbors. Rome responded cautiously at first, then more confidently. Protection led to involvement. Involvement led to control. And control, inevitably, led to war. The Macedonian Wars marked Rome's entry into the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean. Macedonia, once the heart of Alexander's empire, resisted Roman influence. Its kings saw Rome not as an ally, but as an intruder. War followed. Roman legions, hardened by years of conflict in Italy and against Carthage, marched into Greece. They faced armies trained in the phalanx, a formation that had once conquered much of the known world. But Rome's military had evolved. It was more flexible, more adaptable, and in battle after battle, that flexibility proved decisive. Macedonia fell, its power broken, its territories reorganized under Roman influence. Yet even after victory, Rome did not immediately impose direct rule. Instead, it maintained a careful presence, overseeing, advising, influencing. But peace in Greece was rarely lasting. Rebellions erupted, cities resisted, and Rome responded. In 146 BCE, the city of Corinth, one of the wealthiest and most important centers in Greece, rose against Roman authority. The response was swift and final. Roman forces destroyed the city. Its treasures were taken, its buildings burned, its people enslaved. It was the same year Carthage fell. In a single moment, two great centers of the ancient world, one in the west, one in the east, were erased. Rome now stood unchallenged across the Mediterranean. But conquest did not end with Greece. Further east, the Hellenistic kingdom's successors to Alexander's empire began to feel the pressure of Roman expansion. Some resisted, others sought alliance. Many fell somewhere in between. Rome's involvement deepened, wars were fought, territories were absorbed, and slowly, almost quietly, the Republic extended its reach into Asia Minor, Syria, and beyond. Yet Rome did not rule these lands as it ruled Italy. Instead, it created provinces. Each province was governed by Roman officials, often former magistrates, sent from the capital to oversee administration, collect taxes, and maintain order. This system brought wealth to Rome, immense wealth: gold, grain, slaves, art, knowledge. The riches of the East flowed into the city, transforming it in ways no one had imagined. Marble replaced wood, temples grew larger, homes became more elaborate. The Forum filled with monuments to victory. Rome was no longer just powerful, it was becoming magnificent. But with that wealth came change, and with that change came imbalance. The old structure of the Republic had been designed for a city-state, not for an empire. As territories expanded, so did opportunities for profit and corruption. Governors in distant provinces wielded enormous power, often exploiting local populations for personal gain. Back in Rome, the gap between rich and poor widened. The elite grew wealthier, buying up land and building vast estates worked by slaves. Meanwhile, many citizens, especially small farmers, struggled to compete. They lost their land. They moved into the city. They became dependent on the state. The balance that had once defined the Republic began to shift, quietly, but steadily. The army changed as well. Once composed of citizen soldiers who fought and returned home, it now operated across vast distances. Campaigns lasted years. Soldiers became more loyal to their commanders than to the Republic itself. Power was no longer confined to institutions. It was gathering around individuals, and those individuals were becoming more ambitious. Rome had conquered the Mediterranean, but it had also created something it did not fully understand: an empire. Not yet in name, but in reality. Its borders stretched across continents. Its influence reached into every corner of the known world. Its armies were unmatched, its wealth unparalleled. Yet beneath the surface, tension was growing. Because expansion had solved one problem, but created many others. Rome had defeated its enemies. But now, it would begin to struggle with itself. The next wars would not be fought against foreign kings or distant cities. They would be fought within the Republic, between Romans, between visions of what Rome should be. The Mediterranean had become a Roman sea, but the heart of Rome was no longer at peace, and that would change everything. Rome had conquered the Mediterranean. It had defeated its enemies, absorbed their lands, and gathered wealth beyond anything its founders could have imagined. From the outside, it appeared unstoppable, but within, something was beginning to break. The Republic, designed for a city of citizens, now struggled to govern an empire. Its institutions still functioned, its elections still took place, its senate still debated, but beneath these familiar forms, the balance had shifted. The gap between rich and poor had widened into something dangerous. Across Italy, the countryside was changing. Small farms, once owned by Roman citizens, were disappearing. Many had been abandoned during long military campaigns. Others had been taken by wealthy elites who used their influence to expand vast estates. These estates, latifundia, were not worked by citizens, but by slaves. Thousands of them, captured in Rome's wars across the Mediterranean. Cheap, replaceable, and efficient. The citizens who once farmed the land returned home to find nothing left. No fields, no livelihood, no place. They drifted into the city, joining a growing mass of the unemployed and the dispossessed men who had fought for Rome, but no longer had a stake in it. The Republic had grown stronger, but its people had grown weaker. Into this imbalance stepped two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They were not outsiders. They were not rebels in the traditional sense. They were members of Rome's elite, educated, respected, and deeply aware of the system they sought to change. But they believed that Rome had lost its way. In 133 BCE, Tiberius Gracchus became tribune of the plebs. From that position, he proposed a bold reform. Public land, much of it illegally occupied by wealthy families, would be redistributed to the poor. Citizens would once again have land to farm, a place to live, and a reason to remain connected to the Republic. It was not a radical idea. It was rooted in older Roman values, but it threatened powerful interests. The Senate resisted. Debate turned to anger. Anger turned to violence. Tiberius bypassed the Senate and brought his proposal directly to the people. The law passed, but the conflict did not end. When he sought re-election breaking tradition, his opponents claimed he aimed for kingship. And in Rome, that accusation was deadly. A mob of senators and their supporters attacked him. Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death in the streets. His body was thrown into the Tiber. It was the first time in centuries that political violence had erupted at the heart of Rome. A line had been crossed, and once crossed, it could not easily be redrawn. 10 years later, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, followed in his footsteps. But Gaius was different. More organized, more ambitious, more determined. He did not propose a single reform. He proposed many: land, redistribution, subsidized grain for the urban poor, judicial reforms to reduce the power of the Senate, citizenship rights for Rome's Italian allies. It was a program not just of reform, but of transformation. And for a time, it worked. Gaius gained support. His influence grew. Crowds gathered to hear him speak. But once again, resistance built beneath the surface. The Senate, now more cautious after the death of Tiberius, moved carefully. It undermined Gaius politically, supported rival leaders, and waited for an opportunity. That opportunity came when violence broke out between opposing factions. The Senate issued a decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, granting extraordinary powers to protect the state. It was, in effect, a declaration of emergency. Gaius fled the city. Cornered and with no escape, he chose death over capture. Like his brother, he fell, and with him, the hope of peaceful reform faded. The deaths of the Gracchi marked a turning point. Politics in Rome would never be the same again. Violence had entered the system, and once it had, others would learn to use it. In the years that followed, new figures rose. Men who understood that power no longer came only from law or tradition. It came from the people and from the army. One of those men was Gaius Marius. He was not born into one of Rome's great families. He rose through military success, through discipline, ability, and ambition. His victories in North Africa and against invading tribes made him a hero, but his most lasting impact was not on the battlefield. It was in the army itself. Marius reformed the Roman military. He opened recruitment to the landless poor men who had nothing, and therefore everything to gain. These soldiers were equipped by the state, trained as professionals, and bound by loyalty not just to Rome, but to their general. It was a subtle shift, but a dangerous one. The army was no longer just a tool of the Republic. It was becoming a tool of individuals, and individuals could turn it inward. Marius's rise to repeated consulships broke tradition. The old rules, limits on power, rotation of office began to weaken. And where rules weaken, rivals emerge. One of those rivals was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, an aristocrat, a skilled commander, and a man who believed in restoring the authority of the Senate. Their conflict began over a military command, but it did not remain political. It became personal, and then it became something Rome had never seen before. Sulla marched his army on Rome itself, a Roman general leading Roman soldiers, against the city they were sworn to protect. It was unthinkable, and yet it happened. The Republic had crossed another line. Sulla seized control. Marius fled. But the struggle was not over. Marius returned. Blood filled the streets. Enemies were hunted, executed. Power shifted back and forth, not through elections, but through force. Eventually, Sulla emerged victorious. He declared himself dictator, not for a limited time, but with no clear end. He claimed to restore order, to strengthen the Senate, to repair the Republic. But his methods told a different story. He published lists of enemies, the proscriptions. Those named could be killed without consequence. Their property was seized. Their families destroyed. Fear became a tool of governance. And Rome, once a republic of laws, became a city ruled by violence and survival. When Sulla finally stepped down and retired, he left behind a system that still existed, but had been fundamentally changed. The traditions remained, the offices remained, the Senate remained, but the spirit of the Republic had been damaged, perhaps beyond repair. The lessons of this period were clear. Power could be taken, laws could be ignored, armies could be turned against the state, and men who understood this would rise again. Rome had survived its arms, enemies. It had survived expansion, but now it faced something more dangerous, itself. And the next generation would take these lessons even further. Because the Republic was no longer stable, it was waiting for someone bold enough to claim what others had, only tested. By the time Julius Caesar entered the stage of Roman politics, the Republic was already weakened. Its traditions still stood, Its institutions still functioned. But beneath them, something had shifted. Power no longer rested securely in laws or offices. It gathered around individuals, men with ambition, men with armies, men willing to cross lines, others feared. And among them, Caesar would go further than any before him. He was born into an ancient patrician family, one that claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself. But noble birth alone did not guarantee power. By the time Caesar came of age, his family's influence had faded, and Rome was dominated by stronger figures. He grew up in a world shaped by violence. He witnessed the purges of Sulla. He saw how quickly fortunes could change, and he learned an important lesson early. Power was not given, it was taken. Caesar was intelligent, charismatic, and relentless. He studied rhetoric, mastered persuasion, and built connections carefully. He aligned himself with the populares, the political faction that claimed to represent the common people, though its leaders were often aristocrats themselves. He spent lavishly, he hosted games, he gained favor. But popularity alone was not enough. Rome had become too complex for one man to rise alone. So Caesar formed alliances. The most important of these was with two of the most powerful men in Rome, Pompey, a celebrated general, and Crassus, the wealthiest man in the Republic. Together, they formed an informal political alliance, later known as the First Triumvirate. Each man brought something different. Pompey had military prestige, Crassus had wealth, Caesar had ambition, and, together, they controlled Rome. In 59 BCE, Caesar was elected consul. He used his position to pass laws that strengthened his alliances and challenged the authority of the Senate. His actions made enemies among Rome's traditional elite, but he had already secured his next move. When his consulship ended, he was granted command over the province of Gaul. It was a distant land, wild, unstable, and full of opportunity. What followed would change everything. For nearly a decade, Caesar campaigned in Gaul. He fought tribe after tribe. He crushed rebellions. He built bridges across great rivers. He even crossed into Britain, a land barely known to the Romans. With each victory, his power grew. His soldiers became fiercely loyal to him, not just as a general, but as a leader they trusted. And back in Rome, his fame spread. He wrote detailed accounts of his campaigns, clear, compelling narratives that turned his victories into legend. These writings were read aloud, copied, shared. The people admired him. The Senate feared him. Because with every year in Gaul, Caesar was becoming something dangerous, a man too powerful to control. Meanwhile, the alliance that had once held Rome together began to fracture. Crassus died during a failed campaign in the east. Pompey, now alone in Rome, grew wary of Caesar's rising influence. The Senate, sensing an opportunity, moved to act. They ordered Caesar to return to Rome, but there was a condition. He must do so without his army. To comply would mean losing everything, his power, his protection, perhaps even his life. Because once he returned as a private citizen, his enemies could prosecute him, destroy him. Caesar understood the situation clearly. He stood at the edge of a decision between obedience and defiance. In 49 BCE, he made his choice. He led his army across the Rubicon River, the boundary that marked the edge of his command. It was a small river, but crossing it meant everything. It was an act of rebellion, a declaration of civil war. According to tradition, as he crossed, he spoke the words, "The die is cast." Rome was thrown into chaos. Pompey fled the city, gathering forces in the east. Caesar moved quickly, securing Italy with little resistance. Then he followed. The conflict spread across the Mediterranean. Battles were fought in Spain, in Greece, in Egypt. But the decisive moment came at Pharsalus in 48 BCE. There, Caesar faced Pompey's army. Though outnumbered, Caesar's forces were more experienced, more disciplined. They won. Pompey fled once again, this time to Egypt, but he would not escape. Upon arrival, he was murdered by those who hoped to gain favor with Caesar. When Caesar arrived and was presented with Pompey's severed head, he did not celebrate. He wept. Whether from genuine sorrow or political calculation, no one could say. But the message was clear. The old order was gone. There was no rival left. Caesar now stood alone. In Egypt, he became entangled in its internal struggles, forming a relationship with Cleopatra, a queen of intelligence and ambition. Their alliance was both political and personal, linking Rome to one of the richest kingdoms in the world. But Caesar could not remain abroad. Rome awaited, and when he returned not as a politician, but as a ruler. He was appointed dictator, first temporarily, then for longer terms, and finally, dictator for life. He introduced reforms practical, far-reaching, and in many ways necessary. He reorganized the calendar. He planned colonies for veterans. He adjusted debt laws. He expanded the Senate. He brought order. But he also accumulated power. More than any Roman before him, he did not call himself king. But the symbols began to blur. His image appeared on coins. Statues were raised in his honor. He wore garments associated with royalty, and for many, it felt like the Republic had ended, not in law, but in reality. Among the Senate, resentment grew. Some feared tyranny. Others feared irrelevance. A group of conspirators formed men who believed they were saving Rome. Among them was Brutus, a man Caesar trusted. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate. He did not leave. Surrounded by conspirators, he was stabbed again and again. More than 20 wounds. He fell at the foot of a statue of Pompey, the man he had once defeated. The irony was not lost on those who saw it. The conspirators believed they had restored the Republic. They had killed a tyrant, but they had misunderstood something fundamental. The Republic had already been broken, and Caesar's death did not bring it back. It opened the door to something else. More chaos, more war, more struggle for power. The system he had shattered could not be rebuilt, and the world he had helped create would not disappear, because Caesar had changed Rome forever. He had shown that one man could rise above the Republic, that the rules could be bent, broken, rewritten, and others would follow. The Republic had survived kings. It had survived conquest. But it would not survive what came next. The death of Julius Caesar did not restore the Republic. It shattered what little remained of it. The conspirators had believed that by removing one man, they could revive an old system, a system of balance, shared power, and tradition. But Rome had changed too much. The Republic no longer had the strength to stand on its own. Instead of peace, Caesar's assassination brought fear, confusion, and then, inevitably, war. The streets of Rome filled with uncertainty. The Senate hesitated. The people did not celebrate, they mourned. Caesar, for all his ambition, had been loved by many. His death felt less like liberation and more like loss. Into this fragile moment stepped an unlikely figure. He was young, unknown, and underestimated. His name was Gaius Octavius. He was only 18 years, old when Caesar died. At the time, he was far from Rome, studying in Greece, with no army, no great reputation, and little visible power. But he had something else, a name. In his will, Caesar had adopted him as his son and heir. From that moment on, Octavius became more than a boy. He became Caesar. He returned to Rome quietly, without spectacle, but with purpose. Where others shouted, he listened. Where others rushed, he waited. He understood that power in Rome was no longer taken. In a single moment, it was built, carefully, piece by piece. At first, he did not confront his enemies directly. He formed alliances. The most important of these was with Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, and Marcus Lepidus, another powerful figure. Together, they created what became known as the Second Triumvirate, a formal, legal alliance granted extraordinary powers by the state. Its purpose was simple: restore order and punish those responsible for Caesar's death. What followed was not justice, it was revenge. Lists were drawn up, names of enemies of the state. These men were hunted down, executed, and their property seized. Friends turned against friends, families were destroyed. Among the victims was Cicero, one of Rome's greatest orators, whose voice had once shaped the Republic. Rome was bleeding again, but the triumvirate succeeded in its immediate goal. The assassins, Brutus and Cassius, were defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. Both men took their own lives rather than face capture. The Republic had not been saved, it had been buried. But alliances built on power rarely last. With their enemies gone, tension grew between the triumvirs themselves. Lepidus was pushed aside, leaving two men, Octavian in the west, Antony in the east. At first, they coexisted, but distance bred suspicion. Antony, now based in Egypt, formed a powerful alliance with Cleopatra. Their relationship was both political and personal, one that alarmed many in Rome. To Octavian, it was an opportunity. He began to shape a narrative. Antony, he claimed, had abandoned Rome. He had become a servant of a foreign queen. He was no longer Roman. The Senate listened, the people believed, and slowly support shifted. The final conflict came in 31 BCE, at the Battle of Actium. It was fought at sea. Octavian's forces, commanded by his general Agrippa, defeated Antony and Cleopatra decisively. The two fled to Egypt, where, facing inevitable defeat, they took their own lives. With their deaths, the last resistance was gone. Octavian stood alone. He had won, but he understood something that Caesar had not fully grasped. Rome did not want a king, not in name, not openly. So Octavian did not declare himself ruler. He did something far more subtle. He gave power back, or at least he appeared to. In 27 BCE, he formally returned authority to the Senate and the people of Rome. It was a calculated gesture, one that created the illusion of a restored republic. In response, the Senate granted him a new title, Augustus. It meant the revered one. It was not a title of command, it was a title of respect, and it marked the beginning of something new. Augustus did not call himself king. He called himself princeps, the first citizen. He spoke of service, of duty, of restoring order. But in reality, power rested firmly in his hands. He controlled the army. He oversaw the provinces. He influenced the Senate. The Republic still existed, but only in form. In truth, Rome had become an empire. Under Augustus, Rome entered a new age, an age of stability. After decades of civil war, the violence subsided. Borders were secured. Trade flourished. Cities expanded. The world, for the first time in generations, felt calm. This period would later be known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was not peace in the absence of force. It was peace maintained by power. Augustus reformed the system carefully. He reorganized the army into a professional force loyal to the state. He created the Praetorian Guard to protect the emperor and maintain order in the capital. He improved tax collection, stabilized the economy, and invested in infrastructure. Roads stretched across the empire. Aqueducts carried water into cities. Temples and monuments rose across Rome. He once famously said, "I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble." And in many ways, it was true. But his greatest achievement was not in stone. It was in structure. He created a system that could endure, a balance between appearance and reality, between tradition and control. The Senate still met. Elections still occurred. But the true authority was no longer shared. It was centralized, carefully, quietly, effectively, and the people accepted it, because what Augustus offered was something the Republic had failed to provide: stability. After years of chaos, that was enough. He ruled for more than 40 years. An entire generation grew up knowing no other leader. When he died in 14 CE, the Senate declared him a god. Temples were built in his honor, and the system he created remained. The Republic was gone, but few mourned it. In its place stood an empire vast, powerful, and enduring. An empire that would shape the world for centuries to come. And it had begun not with a declaration, but with a careful illusion that nothing had changed at all. For nearly 2 centuries after the rise of Augustus, the Roman world entered a period unlike anything it had known before. The wars did not disappear. The borders were never truly silent. But something had changed. The chaos that had once defined Rome, the civil wars, the power struggles, the uncertainty faded into the background. In its place came something steadier, something quieter, something that later generations would call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was not peace in the way we might imagine it today. It was not the absence of conflict. It was a balance maintained by strength, a stillness enforced by legions. But for millions of people living within the empire, it was real, and it reshaped their world. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched farther than any Roman of earlier centuries could have imagined. From the windswept shores of Britannia to the deserts of Egypt, from the forests of Germania to the markets of Syria, it connected lands that had once been separated by distance, language, and culture. Now, they were bound together, not by sameness, but by structure. Roman rule did not erase local traditions. It absorbed them. Cities across the empire retained their customs, their gods, their languages. But above these differences, there existed something shared. Roman law, Roman administration, Roman order. It was a kind of unity built not on identity, but on function. And it worked. Trade flowed across the empire like blood through veins. Ships carried grain from Egypt to feed the population of Rome. Olive oil moved from Spain, wine from Gaul, silk from the distant east, traveling across deserts and through foreign lands before reaching Roman markets. Goods moved, people moved, ideas moved. For the first time in history, such a vast region was connected in a single system. Roads made it possible. Roman roads were not just paths. They were instruments of control. Built with precision and durability, they stretched across thousands of miles, linking cities, provinces, and frontiers. Along them marched soldiers, merchants, officials, and travelers, all moving within the same network. Messages that once took weeks could now travel in days. Armies could be deployed quickly. The empire could respond. It could hold itself together. In the cities, life took on a rhythm. Rome itself had become a vast, crowded capital, a place of marble buildings and narrow streets, of noise and movement, of ambition and survival. The wealthy lived in spacious villas, decorated with frescoes and mosaics, their homes filled with light and water from private fountains. The poor lived in insularly tall apartment blocks, packed tightly together, often unstable, always crowded. The contrast was visible everywhere. But so was the energy. Markets buzzed with voices, bathhouses filled with conversation and steam, amphitheaters echoed with cheers. Public life was constant, structured, alive. Across the empire, other cities mirrored Rome in smaller forms: forums, temples, aqueducts, theatres. Even far from the capital, the imprint of Rome could be seen in stone and design. In Gaul, Roman culture blended with Celtic traditions. In Egypt, ancient temples stood alongside Roman administration. In the East, Greek language and philosophy continued to flourish under Roman rule. It was not a single culture. It was a layered one. And within that structure, law became one of Rome's greatest legacies. Roman law provided a framework that extended across regions and peoples. It defined contracts, property rights, and legal procedures. It offered, at least in theory, a degree of predictability. Justice was not always fair, but it was structured, and structure creates stability. The army remained at the heart of this system, stationed along the borders. Roman legions protected the empire from external threats. They built forts, guarded frontiers, and maintained order in regions far from Rome itself. But during the Pax Romana, the army was less visible within the core of the empire. Its presence was felt, but not always seen, and that absence of visible conflict created the illusion of peace. Under a series of capable emperors, the system held together. Some ruled with wisdom, others with caution, a few with cruelty. But overall, the structure remained intact. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent under Emperor Trajan. He expanded Roman control deep into the east, pushing the boundaries of the empire farther than ever before. At that moment, Rome stood at its absolute peak, vast, powerful, unmatched. But expansion had limits. His successor, Hadrian, understood this. Rather than pushing outward, he focused on consolidation. He strengthened borders, reinforced defenses, and accepted that an empire too large could collapse under its own weight. In Britannia, he ordered the construction of a massive wall, a physical boundary marking the edge of Roman control. It was not just a defense, it was a statement. Rome had reached its limits, and now it would hold them. Later emperors continued this pattern, maintaining stability, refining administration, preserving order. Among them was Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher, a ruler shaped by duty rather than desire. His reign was not free of hardship. Wars and plagues tested the empire, but his leadership reflected something deeper, a belief that power was not a privilege, but a responsibility. Under rulers like him, the Pax Romana endured for generations. People across the empire lived their entire lives within this system. They were born into it, worked within it, died within it, never seeing its edges, never questioning its permanence. It felt eternal. But beneath the surface, quiet changes were taking place. The economy shifted, the population grew, social divisions deepened. The army, once a symbol of unity, began to change. Loyalty, slowly, began to shift from the state to individual leaders. And while the core of the empire remained stable, the edges began to strain. Small cracks, barely visible, but present. The Pax Romana was not a permanent condition. It was a moment, a long moment, but still only a moment, because peace, when maintained by power, depends on balance. And balance, over time, is difficult to sustain. Yet for those who lived within it, the Pax Romana was something remarkable. A world connected, a system functioning, a life predictable. It was not perfect, but it was stable. And in history, stability on that scale is rare. For nearly 200 years, Rome held itself together, through structure, through law, through force, through belief. But time does not stand still. even for empires. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the stillness began to shift. The peace would not last forever. And when it began to fade, it would not vanish all at once. It would unravel, quietly. The Pax Romana did not end with a single moment. There was no sudden collapse, no single battle that marked the turning point. Instead, the change came quietly, almost unnoticed at first. A shift in rhythm, a growing sense that something, somewhere, was no longer holding together. By the time the 3rd century began, the Roman Empire was vast. Too vast, perhaps, for the system that had once sustained it. What had been strength now became strain. What had been unity began to stretch thin, and slowly the cracks began to widen. The first sign was instability at the top. For generations, emperors had ruled with relative continuity. Even when power passed through intrigue or tension, there had been a sense of order. That order began to break. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire saw more than 20 emperors rise and fall. Most did not die peacefully. They were killed, assassinated by rivals, overthrown by their own soldiers, or abandoned by the very armies that had once elevated them. The throne was no longer a position of authority, it was a prize, one that could be taken, and just as easily lost. The army, once the backbone of Roman stability, had changed. Soldiers were no longer bound by long-standing loyalty to the state. Instead, they pledged themselves to generals' men who promised rewards, land, and survival. When a general proved weak, the army turned. When a stronger leader emerged, they followed. Power became fluid, unpredictable, and dangerously personal. Civil war became common. Armies marched not against foreign enemies, but against each other. The empire, which had once expanded outward, began to turn inward on itself. At the same time, external threats grew stronger. Beyond the northern borders, Germanic tribes pressed against the Rhine and Danube. These were not isolated raids, but sustained pressures, movements of people seeking land, survival, and opportunity. In the east, a new power rose. The Sassanid Empire of Persia, more organized, more aggressive, more determined than the fragmented kingdoms that had come before. They challenged Rome directly, pushing into its eastern provinces and capturing cities that had once seemed secure. For the first time in centuries, Rome was not simply defending its borders, it was losing them. Cities fell, frontiers collapsed, entire regions slipped out of control, and within the empire, something else began to fail. The economy. War is expensive, constant war is devastating. Trade routes became unsafe, agricultural production declined, coinage was debased, its silver content reduced in an attempt to stretch resources. Inflation followed, prices rose, confidence fell. The system that had once allowed goods, wealth, and stability to flow across the empire began to falter. For ordinary people, life became harder, uncertain. In some areas, populations declined, plagues spread, cutting through cities already weakened by famine and war. Entire communities were left diminished, their labor gone, their structures weakened. The sense of order that had defined the Pax Romana began to fade, and with it, the belief that Rome was unshakable. In this atmosphere of fear and fragmentation, the empire itself began to split. Not officially, but in reality. In the West, a breakaway state formed the Gallic Empire controlling parts of Gaul and Britain. In the East, the city of Palmyra, under the leadership of Queen Zenobia, rose to power and carved out its own dominion. Rome was no longer unified. It was divided, not just geographically, but politically and psychologically. The idea of a single empire began to feel distant, uncertain. Yet even in this chaos, the empire did not disappear, because amid collapse, there were still men who tried to restore it. One of them was Emperor Aurelian, a soldier, a commander, hardened by years of war. He moved quickly, decisively. He fought to reclaim lost territories, defeating the breakaway empires and bringing them back under Roman control. He pushed back against external threats and re-established a fragile sense of unity. For his efforts, he was given a title, Restorer of the World. But even he could not escape the pattern of the age. He was assassinated, like so many before him. The crisis was not just about enemies or territory. It was about trust, or the lack of. Emperors could not trust their armies. Armies could not trust their leaders. The people could not trust the future. Everything had become unstable. And yet, the empire endured, not because it was strong, but because it was resilient. It bent, it adapted, it survived. But survival came at a cost. The old systems no longer worked as they once had. The balance between Senate, emperor, and army had shifted beyond recognition. The Republic had long since faded. Now even the structure of the early empire was breaking down. Something new would be required, something more rigid, more controlled, more centralized. The age of subtle power of Augustus and careful illusion was over. The empire could no longer pretend to be what it had once been. It needed transformation. And that transformation would come, not from tradition, but from necessity. From men who understood that Rome could not be saved by restoring the past. It could only survive by becoming something else, entirely. The crisis of the 3rd century did not destroy Rome, but it changed it, irreversibly. And from that change, a new kind of empire would rise, stronger in structure, harsher in rule, and very different from the world that had come before. The Roman Empire had survived the crisis of the 3rd century, but it was no longer the same. The old system, the one built by Augustus, refined over generations, and sustained through the Pax Romana, had begun to fail. It had been stretched too far, weakened by internal conflict, and exposed by external threats. Survival had come at a cost, and now, survival was no longer enough. Rome needed change. Not small adjustments, but transformation. That transformation began with a man who did not come from noble lineage or political tradition. He came from the fine army. His name was Diocletian. When Diocletian rose to power in 284 CE, the empire was still unstable. Emperors had come and gone with alarming speed. Borders had been breached. Provinces had broken away. Trust in the system had eroded. He understood something clearly. The empire was too large for one man to rule effectively. So he did something unprecedented. He divided power, not as a sign of weakness, but as a strategy for survival. Diocletian established what became known as the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. He appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, to govern the western half of the empire, while he ruled the east. Beneath them, 2 junior emperors, Caesars, were appointed to assist and eventually succeed them. For the first time, the empire had multiple centers of authority, multiple capitals, multiple rulers. It was not a return to the Republic. It was something entirely new, a system designed for scale, for control, for endurance. But Diocletian did not stop there. He reorganized the empire's administration, dividing provinces into smaller units to make them easier to govern. He strengthened the bureaucracy, creating layers of officials responsible for taxation, law, and order. The state became more structured, more present, more powerful. He also reformed the military. Armies were increased in size and stationed more strategically along the borders. Defensive positions were reinforced, ensuring that threats could be met more quickly and effectively. The empire, once stretched thin, began to stabilize. But these reforms came with a shift in something deeper, the nature of power itself. Under Augustus, the emperor had been the first citizen. Under Diocletian, the emperor became something more, something distant, something elevated. He adopted titles that emphasized authority and divinity. He wore elaborate robes. He required subjects to bow in his presence. The emperor was no longer a participant in the system. He stood above it. The illusion of shared power, the remnants of the Republic, were finally abandoned. Rome was now openly inactive. Empire, centralized, absolute, controlled. Yet even as Diocletian strengthened the structure of the state, he faced another challenge: religion. The Roman world had always been diverse in belief. Gods from different cultures coexisted, and worship was often flexible, adaptable. But one faith was different: Christianity. It had spread quietly across the empire, among the poor, the urban population, even parts of the elite. Christians refused to worship the traditional gods. They refused to honor the emperor as divine. To Diocletian, this was more than a religious difference. It was a threat to unity, so he acted. What followed became known as the Great Persecution. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, believers imprisoned, tortured, executed. It was the most severe attempt to suppress Christianity in Roman history. But it failed. The faith endured, and in some ways, it grew stronger. In 305 CE, Diocletian did something almost unheard of. He stepped down voluntarily. He retired from power, leaving behind a system he believed could sustain itself. For a moment, it seemed possible, but the balance he created did not last. Ambition returned, rivalries emerged, the tetrarchy began to collapse into conflict. And from that conflict, a new figure rose: Constantine. He was the son of one of Diocletian's junior emperors, raised in a world shaped by reform and instability. Like many before him, he gained power through military strength. He fought rivals, secured territory, and moved steadily toward dominance. But Constantine's story would take a different turn. In 312 CE, before a decisive battle near Rome, he experienced something unexpected: a vision. According to tradition, he saw a symbol in the sky, a cross of light, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether interpreted as divine intervention or strategic belief, Constantine acted. He ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the symbol of Christianity. He won the battle, and with that victory, something began to change. The following year, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan. It granted religious tolerance across the empire. Christianity, once persecuted, was now protected. It was not yet the official religion, but it was no longer forbidden. And over time, its influence would grow. Constantine did more than shift religious policy. He reshaped the empire itself, recognizing that Rome was no longer the center of power it once had been. He made a bold decision. He moved the capital eastward to a city called Byzantium. There, he built a new center of empire, a city of walls, palaces, and churches. He named it Constantinople. It was strategically positioned, economically vibrant, and easier to defend. It would become the new heart of the Roman world. In doing so, Constantine did not abandon Rome, but he redefined it. The empire was no longer tied to a single city. It had become something broader, more flexible, more enduring. In 324 CE, Constantine became the sole ruler of the empire. He had reunited what had been divided. But the world he ruled was no longer the same as that of Augustus. It was more centralized, more structured, more ideological. Christianity spread further, influencing law, culture, and identity. The emperor was now seen not only as a ruler, but as a protector of the faith. The transformation was complete. Rome had changed. From republic to empire to something new. A state defined not just by power, but by belief. When Constantine died in 337 CE, he left behind a legacy that would shape centuries to come. The old Rome still existed, but it was no longer the center. A new Rome had risen in the east, and from that shift, the future of the empire would unfold, not as it had been, but as something entirely different. The fall of the Western Roman Empire did not come with a single moment. There was no final battle that ended it. No single day when the world suddenly changed. Instead, it was something quieter, a slow fading, a long decline that unfolded over generations, so gradual that many who lived through it did not realize they were witnessing the end. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire had already been divided into two halves. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, remained strong, wealthy, organized, and better protected. The Western Empire, centered first in Milan and later in Ravenna, was something different. It still carried the name of Rome, but it no longer carried its strength. Its territories were vast, but difficult to control. Its economy was weaker, its political structure fragile, and its armies, once the pride of Rome, had changed in ways that could not easily be reversed. For centuries, Rome had relied on its legions, citizen soldiers, disciplined, loyal to the state. But over time, those legions had transformed. Fewer Romans were willing or able to serve. So the empire turned outward. It recruited soldiers from beyond its borders, from the very peoples it had once called. Barbarians, Goths, Vandals, Franks, men who did not grow up Roman, but who fought within Roman ranks. At first, this worked. They brought strength, experience, numbers, but they also brought something else, different loyalties. These soldiers were not always bound to Rome itself. They were bound to leaders, to opportunity, to survival. And when the empire could no longer provide stability, those loyalties began to shift. At the same time, pressure from outside increased. Beyond the frontiers, entire populations were moving. The Huns, fierce and relentless, pushed westward across the Eurasian steppe, displacing other tribes in their path. These displaced peoples, including the Visigoths, turned toward Rome, not initially as conquerors, but as refugees. In 376 CE, large numbers of Goths gathered along the Danube River, asking permission to enter Roman territory. They sought protection. They offered submission. Rome allowed them in. But what followed was not integration. It was exploitation. Roman officials mistreated them, withheld resources, and pushed them into desperation. And desperation turned to revolt. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Roman army faced the Visigoths. The result was catastrophic. The emperor himself was killed. A large portion of the Roman army was destroyed. It was more than a defeat. It was a warning. Rome could no longer control its own borders. And the consequences of that failure would echo for decades. The Goths were not driven out. Instead, they remained within the empire, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, always a presence that Rome could not fully manage. Among their leaders was Alaric, a man who had once served Rome, a man who now demanded recognition, land, and legitimacy for his people. But Rome hesitated, delayed, refused. And so, Alaric marched. In 410 CE, he reached the unthinkable, the city of Rome itself. For over 800 years, Rome had not fallen to a foreign enemy. Its name had become synonymous with power, with permanence. But now, its gates opened. The Visigoths entered. For 3 days, they moved through the city. They looted, They took what they could, but they did not destroy it completely. Still, the impact was immense. The psychological shock alone was enough to shake the world. If Rome could fall, what else was certain? Yet even then, the empire did not end. It continued, weakened, fragmented, but still standing. In the years that followed, other groups moved into Roman territory. The Vandals crossed into North Africa, capturing Carthage and cutting off Rome's grain supply. The Franks settled in Gaul. The Visigoths established their own kingdom in Spain. The empire was no longer unified. It was becoming a patchwork, a collection of territories no longer fully controlled from the center. In Italy itself, power shifted away from emperors. The emperors still existed. They wore the purple robe. They held the title, but real authority lay elsewhere, in the hands of military leaders, many of them not Roman by birth. One of these leaders was Odoacer, a commander of Germanic origin. In 476 CE, he took a step that would later be remembered as the end. The Western emperor at the time was a young boy, Romulus Augustulus, a symbolic name. Romulus, the founder of Rome, Augustus the first, emperor. But he held no real power. Odoacer removed him from the throne. He did not declare himself emperor. He did not claim the title. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, the crown and symbols of authority, to Constantinople. A message. There was no longer a need for a Western emperor. The empire, at least in the West, had ended. But it did not feel like an ending. There was no great collapse, no final silence. Life continued. People still lived in cities. Farmers still worked the land. Churches still held their rituals. The structures of Rome did not vanish overnight. They changed, slowly, gradually. The Western Roman Empire did not fall in a single moment. It faded. Its authority dissolved. Its identity transformed. And in its place, new kingdoms emerged, carrying pieces of Rome with them. Its language, its laws, its traditions. The Eastern Empire remained, strong, enduring, still calling itself Roman. But in the West, something fundamental had ended. An idea. The idea of a single power stretching across continents, of one authority ruling the known world. That idea passed into history, but not into oblivion, because Rome did not disappear. It lived on, in memory, in culture, in the systems that followed. The empire had ended, but its shadow remained. And in that shadow, a new world began to take shape. Rome existed for more than 2,000 years. From a small settlement beside the Tiber River to a vast empire stretching across continents, it rose, transformed, and endured longer than almost any civilization in history. It conquered lands, built cities, shaped laws, and connected worlds that had once stood apart. But Rome's greatest achievement was not its power, it was its legacy. Roman law became the foundation of legal systems across Europe, influencing ideas of justice, rights, and governance that still exist today. Its architecture, roads, aqueducts, arches, and domes set standards of engineering and design that continue to inspire. Its language, culture, and systems of administration shaped the development of Western civilization in ways both visible and unseen. Even after the empire itself disappeared, Rome did not. It lived on in ideas, in institutions, in memory. Because empires do not last forever, but what they leave behind can. Rome fell, but its story never truly ended. It simply became part of the world that followed. And so, the story of Rome comes to a quiet close. From a small legend beside a river, to an empire that shaped the world, to a memory that still lives on in the foundations of our lives today. Its armies have long since faded. Its emperors have turned to dust. Its cities have changed, crumbled, and risen again. But its story remains. And tonight, for a little while, you've walked through it. So now, let the noise of history fade into silence. Let the battles grow distant. Let the echoes of marble halls soften into stillness. There is nothing more to follow. No more wars to fight. No more empires to rise. Only rest. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly and allow yourself to drift far from the past into calm and quiet sleep. Good night.